So hopefully you have read the chapter and looked through what Grant had to say. Not too long a chapter. I want to highlight a few things as we go through here. First is this notion of the potential for abuse with diversification. I think this is what gives diversification a bad name for some people at least. Goes something like this. In general, diversification leads to growth, and especially diversification through acquisition, which historically has been the most common route. Well, managers like growth. It gives greater power and prestige, absolutely gives greater compensation. The biggest correlation between anything and management salary is the size of the company. So they certainly have an incentive to grow through diversification. And at least in theory, diversification ought to reduce risk. But diversification does not always lead to better shareholder value. And in fact, there is at least some evidence that on average, not every firm, but on average, diversification may actually reduce value. That's a problem. So let's think a little bit more about the notion of diversification, the whys and the hows, and what you might get from it. Oh, Porter, kind of in response to that period in the 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s, where there was kind of these conglomerates, diversification for diversification's sake, offered what he called the three essentials tests. Others were doing it around the same time as well. It was kind of a time where we were reflecting back on this notion of diversification and thinking about, well, what does that really mean? What is corporate and the different businesses they're in supposed to get us to? So Porter, kind of coming from his economics background, first suggested the attractiveness test, that the diversification should be directed towards attractive industries, or at least those with the potential to become attractive. Yeah, we can debate that, but okay, let's take it as is. The cost of entry test, this is the big one. Cost of entry must not capitalize all future profits. That is, if it costs you more to get into the industry than you're going to get from it, then you're not going to increase shareholder value. And this is often where firms go wrong. It's that bit again mentioned in the little written intro that you look at announcements of acquisitions for diversification, and often the value of the acquiring company actually goes down. That is, the market says they're paying too much for what they're going to get. Which is why we then get to this better off test. You got to get something from the diversification. That is, bringing this other company under the roof of the parent company either has to give it a competitive advantage, or the parent company has to gain a competitive advantage in its own business from moving into the second one. Said differently, that is, some form of synergy must be present. So let's think about this notion of synergy. A big thing to search for, nice buzzword for management to throw out there anytime they do something. Oh, we'll gain synergy from doing this, but it's kind of a nebulous term. Broadly, synergy is this notion that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That is, by putting these things together, we're going to get more than either one could have gotten on their own. But synergy is much easier in theory than it is in practice. That's just the reality. For one thing, real synergies don't always emerge, even when people really believe they've thought about it and they're going to grab for it and they think they're there. They don't always turn out to be there. And then, two, the cost of gaining the synergies may be greater than the benefits. So you really have to think about, what are we getting from this? What is the gain that we're looking for? Synergies can potentially come from various things. Economies of scope, kind of similar to the notion of economies of scale, but gains that we're going to get from sharing across multiple businesses. Okay? So, sharing of a research lab or a distribution system, sharing the brand, maybe abilities in certain functional areas. We're really good at marketing and we can transfer that into a new area, or general management capabilities. Might also economize from internal transactions, but um, again, this is kind of tying these pieces together. What's it costing you to diversify? What are the internal costs going to be of managing the multiple businesses? Um, can you gain some things there? And there is talk of internal labor markets being better, internal financial markets being better. But again, these work in theory more often than they do in practice. When you look at the empirical results, certainly they're mixed. For every study you find that says diversification doesn't really work, another one says it does. Mostly it seems that it's kind of an inverted U relationship. I show a generic inverted U curve here. Inverted U notion is that benefits increase up to a point as you add more of something, and then they decrease. Somebody mentioned in the last discussion that some conflict can be good. Um, yeah, up to a point. This curve works for that. Up to a point, having some conflict can be good. Gets you different viewpoints, gets people to debate things. You avoid groupthink, but too much of it, and it begins to be bad. Well, the same seems to be true of diversification. Right? Whether we're talking about the amount of diversification, some diversification appears to be good. Too much diversification appears to then start taking value away, or the type of diversification, how related or unrelated the businesses are. Um, there appears to be some value in moving into areas that are at least a little different than where you are. But you get too far removed from your core competencies and your abilities, and you begin to decrease shareholder value. So, again, you can find examples on either side of this. Greater related is better, unrelated is better, but on average, the results seem to suggest this inverted U relationship. Again, you kind of think about this notion of relatedness, the operational relatedness. Well, that is kind of where we have historically been. But as Grant points out in the book, identifying relatedness is not easy. Studies have often used SIC codes. How different are the SIC codes? Are they similar at the 4-digit, the 3-digit, the 2-digit level? But there is also this notion of strategic relatedness. That is, do the demands, the general demands of the business, even if the businesses look different on the outside, might they actually come together better? And again, you got to think about the administrative costs. All right? So, easy in theory, harder in practice. All right? You can kind of think more broadly. You don't just think, oh, we're in the quick serve restaurant business, therefore we could also get into the sit down restaurant business. Those are very related. But instead, you kind of think about, okay, maybe it's the nature of how we allocate resources. Maybe it's the general management skills required. Um, Maybe what it is that we're good at in the quick serve business is franchising. So perhaps we could take that to a business that looked entirely different, but where franchising skills were really what was important. So then it might not look related, but it might in fact be related in terms of um, strategic similarities. Right? Might be in the strategy formulation, might be in the management and control approaches. Again, this is a challenge. You see this all the time. Pepsi is a great example when they um, diversified into fast food restaurants, Kentucky Fried Chicken and Taco Bell and Pizza Hut. with this idea that, we make sodas, those industries sell a lot of sodas, um, we should be able to gain synergies across those. But it turned out that managing a soda company and managing quick serve restaurants really were very different skills, and they eventually spun those restaurants off into the Yum brands because they decided they really were not adding value. They were better off separated. And you can find lots of examples like that. You can also find examples where companies have found something that maybe on the surface did appear related and it worked, or in other cases, on the surface might not appear related but might work. You'll see shortly that one of your assignments is to try to find a couple of examples, one good and one bad, and look at what was it that seemed to make them work or not work. I guess the last thing I want you to think about here is what your means of diversification is. Right? There are various ways that you can diversify. Absolutely, you can have what's known as an internal startup. Right? You can build the new business internally. Done less often, but certainly a way where you control and therefore ought to be pretty sure of the value of moving into the new business. Acquisition, much more common means, but acquisitions have their issues. You can't just buy other companies that have real value inexpensively. And often, again, you end up paying out the potential value in the acquisition cost. So even though you might gain something from it, you actually gave away that value in your purchase. But you can think about other means. Joint ventures, various alliances might be other ways where you can take your skills and work with other people who have skills in other areas. So you don't take on the whole acquisition. You're developing it, but you're developing it with somebody else who brings other capabilities. Licensing, the book talks about, where you've got a value, particularly in brands that you want to use in other areas, but you don't really know how to manage those other businesses. Not worth learning or acquiring, but it is worth licensing your name to somebody else. All possibilities, and probably others that aren't on the list. Broadly, when you're going to do this, you need to consider the potential gains versus the costs and the capabilities that are required. It's easy for management to think that I'm a good manager, I can run any business. Evidence on average would suggest that's not true. So, do you really have the capabilities to manage and run the new business, whether you start it up or acquire it? Or should you work with somebody else who's bringing other skills in? And again, go back to that notion of the potential for abuse. Management often prefers acquisitions because they grow the company quicker. They add to the business empire, if you will. But there often may be more value in other means. So, move ahead now. We'll go to the discussion board as well as a little assignment and try to put some of what we've learned here into action.